Hello, I'm Lucy from BookX and I'm here today to review the 2 books I read this week. Two completely different reads this week that I took on. The first was The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker, and then I read The Ghost Tree by Barbara Erskine. And which one should I talk about first? I'm going to talk about this one first, actually, because this is the one I most recently finished. And it was a bit of a surprise to me. I kind of wasn't fully prepped for what I was getting in for. Mostly because, never having read Barbara before, I didn't know that often her books have an element of the supernatural in them. So that took me quite by surprise. But actually, overall, it was an alright read. It is based very loosely on the family tree of Barbara Erskine herself, because her 5th times great-grandfather was a British lord. And well, I'll tell you about the characters, shall I, rather than the author. So it centres around this lord and his life in the 18th century, and it's a time slip novel, so it also jumps to the present day, and that is where our heroine Ruth has returned to Scotland to clear out the house of her sort of long estranged father who has passed away, and she finds the diaries of her ancestor, Lord Erskine. And the more she reads through them, the more she is sucked into his world, and really sort of the blend between past and present sort of comes together. In the modern day, we have this story which is mostly the plot, I guess, the plot-based side of the story is about Ruth's dispute with a man who claims to be her half-brother, who she's never known before, over the inheritance of sort of her father's estate, and working out really who he is and what happens next. But the emotional level of that sort of thing is her reconciling with her father on an emotional level, even though he's passed away, by using sort of her relationship with her ancestors. And we learn about Thomas Erskine, who was her great-grandfather, who joined sort of the Navy at age 14 and then later became a lawyer and rose sort of through the ranks of society. And he helps her and supports her on this journey as sort of we slip back and forward between past and present. It's quite a big novel, it's a pretty understatement really. And as a result, I think what happens quite often with very big novels is they take a little time to get out the blocks. And initially I was thinking, oh, they need to get going. I'm not engaged in this. I'm really not sort of loving the characters. The plot isn't moving fast enough to help me get to know them and to really draw me in. So the first sort of chunk was a bit tedious, but the more and more I stuck with it and sort of the plot did start to develop, I found it increasingly engaging, particularly actually sort of the strand of narrative that happens in the 18th century. I found that really compelling. And the modern one is interesting, but that was the one I think that kept me turning the pages, because I wanted to get back to sort of what he was up to. And though they do cross, initially at least, it was him that kept me moving forward. Even though it's set sort of in part in the modern day, there is something though that feels quite dated about this novel. And I don't necessarily mean that in a negative way. It just sort of, the way that it's written and the way it sort of holds itself sort of harks back to a gentler time. And in part, that's because, you know, people still use landlines and call each other on the actual telephone and knock on doors very politely before they enter rooms in their own house, things like that. But actually, just overall, it is quite a gentle novel and quite non-offensive, I think, is probably the way to describe it. So even though we've got these supernatural elements and things that happen are actually, you know, potentially still quite unpleasant, I think they're striving to be scary, although they weren't really to me. It's all done in sort of quite a genteel way. There are no sort of real big, violent, offensive shocks that are going to put people off, I guess. So I think it's got an awful lot going for it. Actually, even though it was really big, I read it pretty quickly because it's sort of, I hate saying sort of an easy read, but it's one where, you know, you don't have to labour over the sentences. You can actually tear through it pretty quickly. And it is well written. There is nothing that jars. There's nothing that throws you out of the moment. She's clearly, you know, a really polished writer. And that element of it, I definitely did enjoy. So overall, I think if, you know, you like a time slip novel, you like a bit of mystery, a bit of suspense, something that is, you know, a little teeny tiny bit scary, maybe at a push, but explores those kind of themes without, you know, making you get up to check the back door's locked. This might be a book that you would like. The next book that I'm going to talk about is The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker, which I was so looking forward to reading because I've read Pat Barker in the past and thoroughly enjoyed her. Although this novel is certainly very different from, well, at least the Pat Barker that I have read before. And it's actually a retelling, sort of a feminist retelling of the Iliad by Homer, so Greek mythology, and sort of the Trojan War and the story of Achilles, which actually I think fairly well known, even, you know, sorry if you haven't read the Iliad. But actually this story is told sort of through the eyes of the women that are affected through that war, who's often, their perspectives are just completely overlooked. And specifically, it is told through the eyes of Briseis. Now, when we meet her, her town or her city is sort of completely under attack. It is overrun by the Greeks. Her father is killed, her brother is killed, and everyone pretty much that she knows and loves is murdered, and the women are captured. And she is given to Achilles sort of as his prize, as the spoils of war, and she becomes his mistress. I don't know what the right word is, slave, basically. And she's taken to his camp, and the story then that unfolds is pretty faithful to, you know, the Iliad as it started life, to Homer's Iliad, but all shown through her perspective. So you see lots of characters that you might be familiar with, but it's all about looking at how war and conflict affect the women in the camp. And that camp, I have to say, is completely wretched. This book is not for the faint of hearted. It is astonishingly violent. There are bloody, hideous battle scenes. There is really extreme sexual violence. There is disease. There is, you know, smells so rotten that you can taste them on your tongue. There is plagues, there is rats, there is absolutely everything you can imagine. And at times it is a really difficult read because nothing happens off page. Nothing is hinted at really. You see it all in just the most violent, suffocating detail. If you can stomach that though, I find it an incredibly powerful book. And actually by telling it through the eyes of the women, what I really loved is it's about people who slip through the cracks in conflict, I think, really. And that makes it so relevant today. I think, you know, this could have been pretty much about any conflict. And you know what? I said actually, it's really different from the Pat Barker that I've read before, but actually perhaps you can tell that she has written, you know, sort of conflict narratives in the past. So her Regeneration trilogy are, you know, probably her most famous books, and they were about the First World War. And actually the battle scenes, I guess, you know, it is kind of her bread and butter in a way to say, look at the reality of what conflict does and enslaving people and the relationships that are forced to occur as a result. Because Briseis is dealing with living with this man that she doesn't want to be with, against her will, completely enslaved, but also in the knowledge that he personally killed her father and her brothers. But she must find a way, really, to navigate her life with him. And it just builds and builds and builds to this most horrendous and wonderful climax, actually. And it was a book that had me absolutely gripped, if a little bit horrified and terrified, pretty much all the way through. Feminist retellings of sort of Greek mythology are pretty in, actually, at the moment. And I read Circe a couple of months ago by Madeline Miller, and if you've read that too and enjoyed it, then I think you probably will find an awful lot to like in this book too. They are very similar in their themes, and they are very similar sort of in the style of writing as well, although this one has a lot more sex and violence and a lot less introspection, I think. Circe sort of did have sort of a lot of the characters sitting and pondering things, and that doesn't happen so much in this book. But generally, I think if that's the sort of thing that you like, you will not be disappointed by this book either. So this was definitely my favourite of the week, although they were completely and utterly different, and there's a lot to like really in each of them. So I know actually a few people out there are reading Silence of the Girls already, so if you're one of those people, please do talk to me in the comments and tell me what you think. Otherwise, I'd love to know what you are reading this week and whether you have enjoyed it too. So please do talk to me. In the meantime, check out bookouts.com and the apps. They're completely free, and I shall see you soon. Thanks for watching.